All right, welcome everyone to this week's session of Defining and Sustaining a Values-Based Culture. Today we will be discussing training and coaching to fortify. In this session, we will be reviewing the following objectives. Our presenter is Steve Wiley, president of CEEK and author of Navigate Chaos, a #1 bestseller on Amazon, who is on a personal mission to rid the world of zombies in the work earth. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Steve.
All right, thank you, Maggie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us again. If you were with us last week, we had already gone through the foundation of an intentional values-based culture, and now we're working on the application. And last week we talked about establishing and leveraging your intentional culture as a language for accountability, for communications. Well, today we're going to dive deeper kind of into how do you take that same approach and leverage it within your training and coaching and instilling this throughout all aspects of that which you do in your culture. And before we dive into that, I'm going to throw out a question for you. You don't have to respond in the chat, but if you want to, you're welcome to do that. But just give some thought to when is the last time you received any training or coaching related to the values of the organization or the culture of the organization? And I ask this question really from the perspective of often we see in organizations that you get hired, you come in, you have some sort of orientation. Good companies have some sort of orientation to the values and the culture of the organization. But how often does that get reinforced through your training, through your coaching, or is it just a one-time event? And far too often we see the former. And really today is going to challenge you to think about how do you instill that in an ongoing basis through all of the training that you offer, through the coaching and leadership development within the organization. And that really brings us to the objectives today. It's really about giving you some thoughts and ideas that you can consistently and intentionally train and orient the staff to the culture. If it's going to serve as a differentiator for your organization, how you do what you do, you want to just make sure that you're reinforcing that in everything that you do. And we want to talk about give you kind of the framework. This is not going to take a lot of effort. You've done the legwork here to really build a framework to coach leaders and to develop the core competencies that should be a part of your leadership development and your culture in general. And then finally, again, less as an objective, but more as a challenge to you to consider what are the updates, what's necessary, what can you do to take advantage of this disruption to reinforce your culture through some training and or coaching services. We've talked about it every time now. I won't go into great detail, but we're following this GEAR approach. I do want to point out the apply. I often reference that, hey, we have an activity worksheet that you can go out. I've had a crazy busy couple of weeks. I want to let you know that will be out there before the end of the week. It's not there just yet, but should be out there before the end of the week. We'll have an activity worksheet that you can download to apply. So before we jump in, again, most of you, I see the participants out here. I think most of you on this call have been on prior calls, so I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but this is just a reminder. But this is our intentional culture framework, our foundation. Starts with the mission and vision, gives you a compelling purpose. Then you really start to differentiate and distinguish what are the core values, as well as what are the right to play values. We've talked about those. Those are those ideals that set us apart. And the key point here is how do you minimize that degree of hypocrisy where the standards aren't understood, and you define those behaviors that reinforce those core values as the standards for their application, and then you establish a set of very prescribed application of the behaviors and values via the rituals. That in and of itself forms the foundation of your intentional values-based culture. And we talked about the application being how do you hire for the right fit? How do you train, communicate, and coach this into the organization? In our last session, the next two will be on hiring, last one on measurement. So today, again, we're really focused on training and coaching the intentional culture into your organization. So with that in mind, just want to start with the basics here. You know, a lot of times organizations will spend a lot of time and effort defining what are the core competencies of leadership in our organization. I contend your work's done. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't enhance this, but those core values, right here, you see our right to play values. Those right to play values coupled with your core values, those should be core competencies that you expect in your organization if people want to advance in leadership. As a matter of fact, we contend that these right to play values should be just that, a right to play for advancement into leadership. Make these your core competencies. Honesty, empathy, authenticity. What does that look like in your organization? What does accountability look like in your organization? Define these as core competencies. Measure them. Make those the standards by which people will be assessed for advancement into leadership positions in your organization. And guess what? We openly share these right to play values. We call them the 5 whys of leadership. We openly share them because we actually recommend you embrace them. These should be standards that we hold all leaders accountable to. And so then you don't stop there, but you go into your core values, and we've shared our core values of passion, integrity, and creativity. And we've got the standards defined by which we measure or we hold ourselves accountable to these as core values that differentiate us in our organization. So again, I say, these should be core competencies that you're looking for. And we reinforce these. We have a training program that we deliver, that we embrace for ourselves and for others, that we call CEEK, a Better Way to Be Epic. It's all about the application of passion, integrity, and creativity. And we say that it's the creative application of a passion sustained with integrity that creates an epic narrative. If you want to advance in CEEK, if you want to be a part of CEEK, you're going to demonstrate, you're going to be intentional about the application of these values as core competencies. And so first and foremost, you do intentional culture planning, you have already set the foundation for what are those core competencies desired in leadership. And so from that, we can now start to talk about, well, how do you then take that and apply that from a training and coaching standpoint? How do you take those core competencies and continue to embrace that in the organization within your training and coaching programs? So here you see kind of the core outputs. And when we get the activity sheet out there again, you'll have the foundation, you'll have some guidance, some tips for the application of this, the steps that you can take to create some of these core outputs. But a couple of things that I want to point out about, on the left side here, you see core outputs related to training. You don't have to do all of these things, but really it's a challenge to you to look at your training and say, when it comes to culture, when it comes to values and the behaviors that reinforce them, are we just starting with orientation and stopping there? Or how can we continue to build that into an effective training program? And that could simply be, applying some application of our values within every training that we offer. Sometimes that means looking through your job aids and your processes, and how do we reinforce those values, the how that differentiates us? How do we reinforce that in those job aids and those processes? And maybe there's some scenario-based training, things of that nature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically. On the right side, you can see some of the outputs from a coaching standpoint. Well, we've already talked about it. You have the foundation for core competencies for leadership development via your values and the standards by which you measure those values. It doesn't mean you can't augment and enhance that with job-specific skills that are required, but you've got it. And then we challenge you to think of, well, how do we then build those into measurement, how we're assessing leaders in the organization? Some of the things like the roster of coaches and coaching agreements really get into the specifics of, how far you want to go into creating a coaching culture. But we're going to talk more so just about establishing a culture of coaching and give you some tips and some ideas about how to implement that. You don't have to have a formal program necessarily with coaching agreements or internal or external coaches assigned, but how do you create a culture that reinforces feedback and coaching? And we'll share that with you. Again, the activity sheet, we'll share with you just some ideas to go in and review and assess what are your core competencies. Are they aligned to your core values and your intentional culture plan? And then how do you design and develop training and coaching programs that reinforce that, and how do you implement that? So you can review the activity sheet. We'll give you more guidance and tips. But with that, I want to dive into both training and coaching a little bit more. And on the training front, really just want to talk about this need to get out of this mindset that we just send someone to training, we give them the orientation program, and that's it. And when it comes to intentional culture, a lot of times organizations say, yeah, you go to that orientation program, and the next time you hear about the culture and its application could be on your way out the door. And we leverage something that we call the 5 moments of need. My colleague Chris King's on the phone here. He often leverages this when we're working with any kind of training in organizations. And you can see the source of this. I think it was developed by a man named Con Gottfredson. You can check out the 5 moments of need, but this is taking your training beyond just that one-time instance. And you can see these 5 moments. The first is when you learn something new. That is typically you come on board, you may have an orientation program. Then you're looking to enhance that, to gather more information and application. The third step, how do I apply that in the moment? And really, we're following that with this webinar series. So these weekly webinars are all about learning something new, providing some information, while we also give you access to a resource or a site where you can expand upon that. And then we're giving you an activity sheet that you can apply it. And so the same goes for culture. How are you doing that? And then the 4th and 5th steps are really learning to adapt and change, learning to adapt in the midst of a crisis, and learning to solve problems, decision-making. How do you apply your culture in solving problems? So I'll give you a few examples for each of these. So when you talk about learning something new, and I challenge you as you create your training programs surrounded or that are focused on intentional culture, give some thought to how these 5 moments of need play out. But learning something new, we've talked about the orientation training. That's kind of you get the foundation, enhancing that. Well, where are there moments that you have refresher training related to your values and your culture and the behaviors that reinforce those? That could be online, that could be access to videos or different materials. It could also be any training program. It could be technical training specific to a job. I would encourage you to just say, how can we, through every opportunity that we touch the employees of the organization, how can we take 5 minutes out of that agenda, 10, 15 minutes to reinforce our culture and our values and how this aligns? Leverage every opportunity to touch your employees to emphasize, to reinforce the values and behaviors that really differentiate the organization. How do you apply what you learn? How do you build into job aids, standard operating procedures, culture and values? We're working with an organization right now on contact tracing for COVID-19. And they're putting together scripts for how they respond and support individuals that are being affected by this. And this organization is focused and concerned about the wellness as a core value of their own employees. And so they're actually building into their performance support system some scripts and tips that can remind them about maintaining their wellness, their balance, their sanity, their health, while they're helping others deal with this problem. So it's just another way of, in the application, in the standard operating procedures, they're reinforcing their value or their priority on the wellness of their own resources. So how can you build some of your culture into those standard processes? Learning to adapt or change, as I mentioned, now is a great time to kind of take a look at, okay, what new behaviors and or rituals, we've talked about that in past sessions, but then how do you train or coach that into the organization? This doesn't have to be a pandemic. This could be, as you see here, acquisitions, mergers, big contract wins, anything that creates a disruption in the organization. So it's kind of implementing new thoughts and training and ideas and being intentional about that. Finally, there's this notion of scenario-based training. And How do you build into your organization and train them to understand in the moment? How do you prepare for what might come? Last week, we talked about in communications, maintaining a repository of stories. Well, you've done some of the legwork for creating training around scenario-based situations. You can take those stories that just were good, compelling, insightful application of your core values and behaviors and just translate those to scenarios. What if scenarios? What would you do if faced with this situation? And then you actually have the outcome that you can share. And so in your training sessions, if you take 5 or 10 minutes out of every training, you can build that in. That gives you kind of that decision testing, putting people in situations where your values could be tested. Really powerful stuff to build in related to your culture. So then let's talk about culture of coaching. You may or may not have a formal coaching program in your organization. Some organizations offer independent coaching. We do that for some organizations. Regardless, I challenge you to say, okay, let's just build a culture of coaching, of feedback. And so I want to just give you some tips that you can apply that would promote that in your organization. And first and foremost, if you're going to have a culture of accountability and you want to provide feedback and coach, you got to start by inviting feedback. So if you're a leader, you got to set the example for what it means to say, I want to hear the feedback. Give it to me. In our own organization, some of my colleagues are on this call. They know full well that we've actually experimented with this. We had a session where, I sat and said, everybody, I want you to give me some feedback. I want to know where I can improve. So first and foremost, before you go giving others feedback on their application of values and behaviors in the culture, you got to show what it means to be able to receive it. And so as a leader, encourage it, invite it, welcome people the opportunity to take your values and your behaviors and to point out to you where they may be inconsistent in your own application or where you may be doing a great job, and encourage both. And my team is very open about both those to me, and I appreciate that very much. And that allows me then to provide that feedback. So now that you have this language of accountability, we can leverage those behaviors and those values and say where we're falling short or where we're doing a great job, and be very open with both of those things. And you can see here in the notes that I've got just a reminder to emphasize process feedback versus person feedback. So we want, whether it's constructive criticism or just positive feedback, you want to reinforce the behaviors. You want to say, yeah, you've done a great job owning accountability, about being clear on meeting agendas, on collaborating with your colleagues, with your peers, rather than saying, you're a great person, you're a great leader, you're a great manager. Give the specifics of the behaviors. That is so much more powerful on both the positive feedback and the constructive critique side. So coach that into the organization. Learn to do that well. We also just recommend, again, you don't need formal programs for this, but you want to measure. And we're going to talk about this more in the last session, but you can build your values and behaviors into your assessment instruments. You can build them in, and if you do 360 assessments or things of that nature, you can identify where we're doing well. It's another source of feedback from your colleagues, things of that nature, and for a team as a whole. And once you have that kind of feedback, whether it's through instruments, whether it's verbally given, you are then in a position where people can identify and leverage their strengths to the benefit of the organization, but also you're in a position where you can point out blind spots. And this is the one area that we talk about really to prevent the destroying engagement in organizations. You got to be able to call out the blind spot of hypocrisy. And again, this is not intentional, not typically intentional or malicious, but being able to call out where certain behaviors may be inconsistent with professed values. I gave some examples earlier where I profess balance as a core value in our organization, And because we had a language, a program manager was able to tell me, you know what, behaviors of the email blasts I was sending out every Saturday morning were not consistent with the messaging. And it just allows us to have that conversation. And then finally, I put in here just, again, to promote a coaching culture is the challenge, and to set targets and set goals. And if you've defined your values and the behaviors that reinforce those values, you can leverage those behaviors to set some clear challenges or guidance on how people can improve. We have a core value of creativity, and you know, I can challenge people to set aside time for creative thought, to write blog posts, to create videos, different things. It just provides a foundation that you can challenge your colleagues, all based upon your intentional culture. Last week, I introduced this concept of a communications checklist. And I just wanted to point out here, you can do the same for your training and your coaching. You don't have to be very formal about this. It could just be leveraging your corporate credo card, what we have. And just as you're creating training programs and saying, okay, what's a behavior that we can reinforce in this training program? Always encourage you to go back to that and just say, via the coaching that I'm doing, you know, how can I put this in terms of the language that we're using as an organization? What can I build into the training today? So you can always come back to this checklist. So with that, I really just want to leave you with some things to consider that you can take away here, but step away and really give some thought to, are our values aligned with our leadership competencies? Are they two different things? And really just encourage you, if you took the time to define right to play values and core values, should those not be reflected directly in the leadership competencies, as that's what we're looking for advancement in this organization? And how can you bring that alignment and bring some clarity there? So I challenge you to think about that. Where does that stand? You've already done the work if you've done this intentional culture work. And what can I do to integrate our values into our culture and training so that it's not just a one-time orientation, but this is something that gets reinforced over and over. And whether or not you have a formal coaching program, how can you incorporate that into your coaching and build a culture of coaching as well? And then finally, in the midst of everything going on currently, is there an opportunity that you could take some of your intentional culture and leverage it leverage this time of disruption as an opportunity where you can enhance some training to promote it, to think differently? How do we sustain this over time and leverage while people are working from home to really promote the culture that we desire? As a reminder, next steps, this was episode 5. We've got 2 more, but again, the GEAR methodology we're providing, you can go back out on our landing page. There is additional information. There's some blog posts and additional information. You'll have the video up probably within a day, and relative to the application, as I said, I'll have that activity worksheet out there for you that will give you some more process focused. You know, how can you go in and assess your current training, your current coaching? What are some tips and steps that you can do to apply to implement your intentional culture plan? So that will be out there before the end of the week for the application. And as always, I'll share my contact information here in a minute, but you're always welcome to email me directly or call if you have any questions or anything I can support you with from a training, coaching, or any aspect of anything we've discussed up to this point. And next week, we're going to dive into this hiring for the right fit. And so if you have this desired culture, one of the most challenging things, if you get a bad cultural fit, doesn't mean a bad person, but it may, sometimes it's just not the right cultural fit. That can have a significant impact on engagement. And we're going to give you some tips and guidance about what you can do to make sure that your criteria for who you're hiring just increases your probability of success of hiring for the right cultural fit. So critical, and the last session as well will be critical about measuring the impact of intentional culture plans, the impact that's having on your engagement, your wellness in your organization, your retention, things of that nature. So I hope you'll be able to join us next week. As a reminder, here's my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out and mention this in the past, but in the midst of the chaos going on right now, we slashed the price of the book. So if you or anyone you know is interested, paperback is, I think, marked at $7.99 currently, and Kindle version $2.99. So I hope you can take advantage of that. So with that, let me turn it back over to you, Maggie. I don't know if there's any questions. Happy to answer those. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
All right, I sent everybody the link to the page that will have this video recording as well as the activity book. Just give us a few days to get both of those up. The slides are already up if you wanted to review them. That's also the page where you can find all of the past webinars, activities, and recordings. If nobody has any questions, then I guess we can end it here. And thank you guys for coming. We'll see you next week.